And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder, saying, "Come and see."
Noise of Thunder Radio with Christian J. Pinto.
Okay, praise the Lord, you guys, and welcome. I'm Chris Pinto. This is Noise of Thunder Radio. Today on the show, what we're going to do is we've got another one of our special programs where I'm going to share with you guys an interview that I did here a short time ago with the great American author and investigative journalist, G. Edward Griffin. G. Edward Griffin. Now, I told you guys about this interview probably a little bit more than a month ago, maybe a month and a half or so, where I talked about how I was setting things up with Mr. Griffin's secretary, and we were looking forward to doing an interview. Well, praise the Lord, we were able to follow through on it, and we completed the interview. And of course, parts of that interview are going to be included in our upcoming documentary on the Reese Committee. And that documentary is in the works. We're still doing some of the filming for it and are going to be working on the editing going forward. Well, what I wanted to do is, because we're not going to be able to include the whole thing, I thought I would share the audio of our conversation with Mr. Griffin, my conversation with him, and let you guys hear the whole thing as part of a Noise of Thunder Radio episode. And then you will be able to see how this looks, parts of it anyway, when it's edited into the final documentary. Now, the documentary on the Reese Committee is going to be a very powerful testimony, because what the Reese Committee uncovered back in the 1950s, and remember, this was a congressional committee, what they uncovered is exactly what is impacting our country today. The reason our nation is in peril of falling into the hands of communism and globalism is because of programs that were set forth back in the early part of the 20th century. And that is what the members of the Reese Committee uncovered in the 1950s. All right, so without any further ado, let's begin my conversation and interview. Here it is. Mr. G. Edward Griffin, author of the great famous book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is, I think, a legendary work, at least in my community, conservative Christian community. A lot of people who know about that book. But today we're going to talk about the Reese Committee and an interview in particular that you did that is, I think, very important, where you're covering in that interview some of the most important issues that are affecting our country today. People are, sorry about that, let me get that alarm, but people are wondering why so many of our young people are coming out of the schools and out of the colleges and universities, and they have all of these very radical left-wing ideas that lean toward Marxism. They want socialism. They think communism is a good thing. And your interview with Norman Dodd seems to answer that question. So I wanted to ask you, how did you meet Norman Dodd? And in your opinion, why is his testimony so important?
I met Norman Dodd initially, not face to face, but because of his testimony before a congressional committee. I don't remember whether it was the House Committee on Un-American Activities or the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. But anyways, one of the congressional committees on internal subversion. And I was greatly impressed because he told his story of how he wound up involved with the Reese Committee and became a head investigator of the tax-exempt foundations. And perhaps a little background is essential. I'll finish off where I was going with that. And later on, I found his location was in Virginia. And so I was there on a mission to record some components of a documentary I was working on. And my camera crew and I were there over the weekend. And so I tried my luck at contacting Norman Dodd, and I was able to find him. It was very good luck. And I told him who I was, and I was interested in recording his story if he were willing. And he said, oh, yes, of course. He was an elderly gentleman at the time, and I was worried about his health. But in any event, so that's how it all started. And the question first, I think, needs to be answered as to why was there an investigation of tax-exempt foundations, of all things? Seems strange because that would be the last thing in the world you'd expect that would be contrary to the principles of, American tradition and so forth. But I found out by a little research in later years that right after World War II, some of the largest tax-exempt foundations, like the Carnegie Endowment Fund for International Peace and the Ford Foundation and big organizations like that, were publishing out and out communist propaganda. They were publishing essays and speeches written by Joseph Stalin, for example. And so there were a lot of well-informed people around the country who were up in arms about this. And I was surprised to find out that the Hearst newspapers had actually written editorials exposing this and condemning this situation on the front page of the Hearst newspapers, editorials on the front page, headlines and so forth. Tax-exempt foundations spreading communist propaganda. And I thought that I didn't know any of that. So that was the reason there was a public outcry to find out what on earth is going on with these tax-exempt foundations. And so the issue became a hotly debated one in Congress. And that's when the Reese committee was formed. The whole purpose was to investigate this communist propaganda that was coming from these large corporations. Well, they hired Norman Dodd as their chief investigator. So that's who Norman Dodd was and how he comes into the picture. And I read a little bit about this in that testimony before the Congressional Committee on Un-American Activities, or whatever it was, the Senate or the Congress committee. And it was stunning what he revealed. So I made note of his location. He was in Virginia, Arlington or someplace like that. And I happened to be in Virginia with a camera crew. We were picking up some footage for a documentary we were doing. And so I tried to reach Norman Dodd, and I was very fortunate that I reached him on the telephone and asked him if he would be available for us to, and willing for us to record part of his story. And he said, oh, sure. And so I was delighted. It was a kind of a windfall. And I think it was a Saturday. We met him at the offices of Congressman Larry McDonald, who is from Virginia. And so we recorded this in Congressman McDonald's office. It was kind of funny because it's not too far from an airport. And when those airplanes took off from the airport, they made a lot of noise. And there was one taking off about every 4 minutes or sometimes more often. So even though we were able to edit out all of those interruptions, it was done in little short pieces while we had to wait for the airplanes to fly overhead. But nevertheless, now we get to the real story. So who was Norman Dodd? He was a chief investigator for the Reese Committee. Now, there were a lot of people in Congress at the time who didn't want the committee to function. And they did everything to prevent it from being funded, everything they could to prevent it from holding hearings. They tried to load it up with staff members who were opposed to the committee. And in fact, Norman Dodd's secretary, I guess you'd call her, she's the one that was in charge of all of the files and minutes and so forth, was very opposed to the committee. Her opinion was, well, these are tax-exempt foundations. What could possibly be wrong with them? And some of the newspapers, other than the Hearst, came on and said, this is just a witch hunt. And so there was a big controversy about it at that time. And so that's how it all started. Norman Dodd was the chief investigator, and he was going upstream against powerful people in Washington who did not want this committee to hold hearings or publish anything that they found.
Now, the Reese Committee was named after Congressman B. Carroll Reese, right?
That's correct. Uh-huh.
And what was his involvement? Was Congressman Reese, was he a patriot? Was he concerned about the well-being of the country? Is that why this committee was associated with him?
That's a good question. I never came across any information about his personal view, except that I don't know whether he was just politically taking on the task because it was a popular movement or whether he was strongly motivated. But I have a feeling that he was strongly motivated because he held firm against this opposition that was flooding to him from other congressional sources.
All right, well, let me ask you this then. I think probably the most important discovery in terms of your interview with Norman Dodd was that these tax-exempt foundations were working together to get control of America's education system. What was their overall purpose in controlling the education system?
Their purpose was rather shocking to Norman Dodd. The story that he told to our cameras was quite dramatic. He said he went to visit the heads of these organizations. I think it was the Ford Foundation was the first one, as I recall. And he describes it something like this. The president of the Ford Foundation said, Mr. Dodd, we welcome you here. We know why you're here. And Dodd was surprised by that. And he said, well, you know why I'm here? He said, yes, you want to know something about why we're doing what we do. And Norman Dodd said, yeah, that's exactly why I'm here. He said, well, tell us then, why are you doing what you're doing? And the president of the foundation put it like this. He said, we are operating under directives directly from the White House. And those directives are to so change the culture and the system in America so that it could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. And Dodd said he almost fell off of his chair when he heard that. He said, what? He said, well, Mr. Gaither was the name of the president. And he said, Mr. Gaither, if that's true, why don't you tell the American people that that is your objective? Because after all, the American people are funding your tax exemption, and then we won't have to investigate this any further. And Gaither said, Mr. Dodd, we would never dream of doing such a thing. And it was, I can just imagine sitting there as a fly on the wall, listening to this conversation. So that's sort of a little bit of the background on this. And so Dodd goes on to explain what he learned, not only there with Mr. Gaither, but also at the Carnegie Endowment Fund for International Peace. And I think the most revealing part comes from the Carnegie Fund. And this is what came out of that investigation. The president of the Carnegie Fund said to Mr. Dodd, you ask a lot of very detailed questions. He said, I have a proposal to make to you. Why don't we just invite your secretary to come over here and examine the minutes of our meetings, our board meetings. Everything is in there. All the answers to your questions are in our board meetings. And then we don't have to waste a lot of time dealing with things that even I may not know the answer to. So Dodd said that sounded like a great idea. So he sent over his secretary. Now, this was the lady that was very much opposed to the work of the Reese Committee. And she went over there with her little stenographic machine or whatever it was in those days and started to read the minutes and dictate them into her machine and came back and typed them out. Mr. Dodd said that she almost had a nervous breakdown because she was so shocked by what she discovered in the minutes. And Dodd thought that probably the guy that set this up, the new president, was a young fellow and probably didn't know it was in the minutes himself. Otherwise, he would never have done it. But anyway, here's what came out of the minutes of those meetings. The decision was that the future of the world belonged to collectivism. Collectivism was the future, and the old style of American tradition, individualism and personal liberty, it served its purpose in its day, but it was now time for it to go. History had changed the world. Now we were ready for something at a higher level, more productive, less productive of conflict and that sort of thing. And it was all the arguments for collectivism. And so the fund decided that they would raise and apply a great deal of money so to change the culture and the educational system and the traditions of America so it could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Now, it wasn't the Soviet Union so much. It was just that it wasn't that they singled out the Soviet Union, except that it was about the most opposite that you could imagine from American tradition. The idea, as I interpreted it, was that if you could merge America with the Soviet Union, you could merge it with anything. And so the idea was not just America and the Soviet Union, but it was world government. That's really what they were talking about. So to change the concepts and traditions and culture of America so that it could be comfortably merged with world government. That was the goal. And then they went on and said very scholarly dissertations as to how do we do that? And the suggestion was made, the plan was formed. We will do that best not by changing the older folks, because they're pretty much, they're imbued with their ideas and traditions, but they will die off in time. This will be a multi-generational process. We must capture the minds and the hearts of the young people. And so they said, we will go into the field of education. We will apply the funding that we have, which was formidable. We will apply our funding so to change the history books and the teaching courses and the academic environment to favor collectivism over individualism. And then they went on to describe at great length how they would do that. And that's where it really gets interesting, because from that point forward, Mr. Dodd had found out that they had succeeded in doing that by funding such things as Columbia University and the Teachers College there, and all of the the people that we heard about in early days of American education, all the what we would call today the liberals, the collectivists, the leftists, and so forth, all had their origins with funding that came from the tax-exempt foundations, and their deliberate plan was to provide scholarships to young academics, young scholars who had the promise of becoming the future academician leaders and history writers who would say that the collectivism was in their teachings and in their books, would argue that collectivism was the wave of the future. And so that's how it all began.
Now, when you say collectivism, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because my understanding is, and correct me where I may be mistaken, collectivism and communism, are they essentially the same thing?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think this issue that you just described is perhaps the most important issue of our day. People do not know what collectivism is, and nor its opposite, what individualism is. I've spent much of my life trying to elaborate on that point. I'll try and make it simple. The word collectivism is sort of foreign to our ears in the modern time. But I was surprised to learn when I started to read some of the books that were written 100 years ago that the word collectivism was commonly used and universally understood. And its opposite, which is called individualism, also was understood and the word commonly used. So I had to say, what is this business here? Well, it's a very simple concept. Collectivism is a concept that advocates that the group or the collective is more important than the individual, and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. Now that is communism, but it's the fundamental element of communism. It's also the fundamental element of fascism. It's also the fundamental element of liberalism and progressivism and all these other isms that have come and gone, the New Dealism and all these things. It's the fundamental issue. Forget these other names. They just get in the way. Collectivism is the word. And it's a very simple concept that the group is more important than the individual, whereas individualism is the opposite, that the individual is the basic unit of society. And the idea that the group is more important because it's for the greater good of the greater number is where the whole thing hinges. Because on the collectivist side, that is answered by counting. In other words, if you get 51% of the vote, well, you can do anything you want to because that's for the greater good of the greater number. So the poor 49%, they lose everything. Because if you really believe in collectivism, it's for the greater good of the greater number. So it's a numbers game. But individualists believe that the greater good of the greatest number is by protecting the rights of the individual. And that actually is the greater good of the greater number. But it's not done on the basis of numbers. It's done on the basis of individualism. In other words, that the individual is the basis, or should be the basis of society. Now, gets pretty deep because, I was taught collectivism in school at the university. We didn't. Now it's in the grade schools. I didn't get any of this in grade school. But by the time I went to the university, they taught collectivism, and it sounded good to me. What the heck? Yeah, the greater good of the greater number. That's democracy, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, it is. And it brings up another issue, is democracy a good thing? And I discovered also in my research that 100 years ago, the democracy was not considered to be a very good thing at all. In fact, our founding fathers went out of their way when they were drafting the Constitution and putting together our American Republic. They went out of their way to say that a democracy was one of the worst possible forms of government. And that's why they spoke not of democracy, but of a republic. A republic is based on the principles of individualism, but a democracy is based on the principles of collectivism. And I think the easiest way, since we don't have all day to talk about this, the easiest way to put this into focus is to think of a lynch mob. Now, in a lynch mob, there's only one dissenting vote, and he's at the end of the rope. So if you really believe in democracy, you have to be all for lynch mobs. You see? And when you think about that, it's mind-boggling because we believe that we have individual rights, and yet we're still saying, yeah, democracy this and democracy that. And it turns out, when you look at history, that every democracy, or one that even got close to being a true democracy, has self-destructed. Because once you get to the point that the majority of the people can plunder the minority just by their sheer numbers, then the system falls apart. So it's a fundamental issue. And we are struggling in our world today because everybody thinks that democracy is the favorite and the best form of government, when in truth, it's a self-destructive form of government. So all of that is built on this issue that came up back when Norman Dodd was interviewing people in the tax-exempt foundations. And so I guess the best way to close this part off is to say that the world, the whole world literally, has fallen for this siren call of democracy or collectivism. And that's the problem in the world today.
Okay, you guys, so we are going to take a break at this point and go to our commercial break. When we come back, we're going to hear more from G. Edward Griffin. Don't go away, because I think you're going to be both informed and inspired by the things Mr. Griffin has to say and his exhortations for our generation today. Mr. Griffin is 90 years old, and he has words of wisdom as an elder American for the younger generation. that I think are very powerful and very important. And we're going to hear all of that and more when we come back right after this.
Adullam Films presents a stunning new documentary, The True Christian History of America, exploring the Bible-based Christian origins of the early American view of freedom, tracing the principles of liberty back to England and the Great Reformation. For many years, our schools have taught that the founding of our republic was from the Deists, or the Enlightenment in France. But is that truly the case? Did the Enlightenment first declare no taxation without representation or trial by jury? Were they the champions of freedom of speech or of the press or the right to bear arms? And why did Samuel Adams declare that the reign of political Protestantism would commence just before signing the Declaration of Independence? Filmed on location in both the United States and Europe, The True Christian History of America is now available at adullamfilms.com. That's adullamfilms.com. Now available at noiseofthunderradio.com. That's noiseofthunderradio.com.
Adullam Films presents an exciting new documentary, Bridge to Babylon, Part 3 in an award-winning series on the untold history of the Bible. Dr. Jack Moorman calls it a masterful presentation of what is the single most important issue facing Christians today, the defense of the Bible as the Word of God. Why was the Bible changed in 1881? Why have so many churches abandoned biblical inerrancy? And what direction are scholars taking the Scriptures today? Learn the truth in Bridge to Babylon, the sequel to A Lamp in the Dark and Tares Among the Wheat. Bridge to Babylon is now available at noiseofthunderradio.com. That's noiseofthunderradio.com.
Noise of Thunder Radio.
Okay, we are back. Praise the Lord, you guys. I'm Chris Pinto. This is Noise of Thunder Radio. Today in the show, we are sharing with you our extended interview with G. Edward Griffin, which we're going to continue with here in just a moment. Before we do, I wanted to let you know, for those of you who might be listening to our radio program through Worldview Weekend, or maybe you're listening to us through Apple iTunes, or maybe on SoundCloud, that we do have our own website at noiseofthunderradio.com. That's noiseofthunderradio.com. There you can find our radio shows. We've got dozens and dozens of past programs that you can find on our website. Also, if you go to our main site, which is our production company website at adullamfilms.com, ADULLAM films.com. That's our film production company website, where you can find all the documentaries that we have produced over the years. That's primarily what I do, is make documentary films. In fact, we're working on several documentaries right now, one of them on the Reese Committee from the 1950s. We've got two others that are under development. One is Antichrist, the Lost Doctrine. We've got many of you out there that have sent us emails, have made phone calls, and so on. We want you to know, yes, that documentary is still moving forward, slowly but surely. But that's just the way we've had to make films from the beginning. We just keep at it until, as the Lord leads us, we get it done by the grace of God. So Antichrist, the Lost Doctrine, also our documentary on the Jesuits, American Jesuits. And we're going to be talking about the influence of the Jesuit order in the United States of America in particular. And our third project is the Reese Committee, on the Reese Committee. Now, we're not sure that that's going to be the final title. Right now, that's the working title on the film. We've thought about giving it the title Foundations of Treason. That's the alternative title. That one I'm kind of leaning toward because it plays upon the word foundations. And really, what we're uncovering is the foundations of how all this Marxist treason began in our country. And it began through these tax-exempt foundations. That's why we play upon the word with that title. So anyway, we've talked about that. I also want to mention, on behalf of Mr. Griffin himself, G. Edward Griffin is not only an author, he's not only a documentary filmmaker, but he is also the founder and president of, he's the founder of Red Pill University and the Red Pill Expo. Red Pill University and the Red Pill Expo. Now, if you go to their website at redpillexpo.org, they are getting ready to have a conference in July in Indianapolis, Indiana. July 9th and 10th is going to be the Red Pill Expo. And I have to tell you guys, you look at the list of speakers who are going to be there. G. Edward Griffin is going to be there. Alex Newman, who I've had the pleasure of meeting before. He's a journalist, an investigator. He's also an author. He interviewed me for his magazine, The New American. He works with and for The New American. Alex Newman's kind of all over the place. He's a great guy, very, very nice guy. Also, Del Bigtree from The High Wire is going to be there. And Del Bigtree is great in terms of talking about these vaccine issues, the whole coronavirus, COVID-19 controversy. He's been right on the cutting edge of this from the beginning, and he's going to be there at this Red Pill Expo. He's one of the speakers there. If you go to their website, you can see they've got a whole list of different people who are going to be speaking. I honestly am not familiar with all of them, but Alex Newman and Del Bigtree, I know both of those guys. Well, I've met Alex Newman. I've never met Del Bigtree, but I'm familiar with his work, and I think he does a great job confronting the vaccine issues. And, of course, Mr. Griffin himself. But check all of that out. They've got all the information on their website at redpillexpo.org. And again, their conference is going to be in Indianapolis, Indiana in July 9th through 10th in Indianapolis, Indiana. Check it out at redpillexpo.org. All right, now we're going to continue with our discussion with Mr. Griffin and his interview with Norman Dodd. Norman Dodd, who was the director of research for the Reese Committee. But at this point in the interview, I asked Mr. Griffin specifically about that form of government that America was originally established upon. It's often said that we're a democracy, but the reality is we're not really a democracy. Ours is a republic, and to the republic for which it stands. You know, we say that, or at least we did growing up in the Pledge of Allegiance. But the United States is a republic. We're not a pure democracy. But Mr. Griffin and I talked about that very issue, and here's the question that I specifically asked him during the interview. Listen.
Do you think it's fair to say that what our founding documents put in place was a republic with a democratic process? Do you think that's a more accurate way?
It probably is a closer definition to the truth. I don't even like the word democratic, although it does have, if you look up the word democratic in the dictionary, it does have multiple meanings. And one of those meanings would be popular vote or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I don't even like the word because it's so deceptive. The democratic process is really a process of democracy. And now I have to admit, we've all been trained to have a great deal of reverence for the word democracy. Right. And we fought wars to defend democracy against fascism and so forth. But fascism is democracy. And that's the thing that people don't realize. And all democracies are ruled by dictators who claim to speak for the majority. See, that's how it works. The majority speaks. And so some psychopath stands up and say, I speak for the majority. And we're going to defeat these power-hungry we're going to eliminate all these elitists. And of course, they are the elitists that are giving these speeches. But the average Joe six-pack guy, it sounds good to him, and he votes them into office, and they become the dictator in the name. Well, look at communism. It's always the people's republic, right? It's never the dictator's republic. It's the people's republic. Yeah, sure it is.
All right, here's something I want to, before we get away from the education system issue, one of the things that you discussed with Mr. Dodd was the rewriting of American history books. Can you talk about that whole process?
Well, yes, that was the part of it. They funded, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Teachers College at Columbia University, and they hired writers who were handpicked by them, young people who were seeking their doctoral thesis, and they sent them off to universities in London, and they handpicked the ones that had the most promise, smart fellows, I'm sure, but they all were imbued with this idea of collectivism. They actually believed in it, and which is easy to do. But anyway, they were believers, and they were asked to rewrite history books that would be used in American schools. Well, they thought they approached some of the existing writers, and I've forgotten the names. I think Toynbee might have been one of them, and asked them to rewrite their own history books, and they were turned down flat. Said, "Are you kidding? No, this is history. We're not going to rewrite it just because you guys have got a lot of money and are going to pay us to do it." So they decided then that they were going to have to have their own stable. I think they used that word, their own stable of writers. And that's when all the scholarships became very popular, where they could give scholarships to, quote, promising writers, promising historians. And after a generation, it was done. It was done. When the old ones died off and the new ones came up with all of the funding behind them, it was done. And so the future teachers were coming out of college as graduate students at that time. And so the teachers today were all a product of the teachers of yesterday, who were a product of the funding from the tax-exempt foundations. That's the connection.
So they basically channeled the funding to the people who were willing to go along with rewriting history and promoting these left-wing collectivist ideas.
Absolutely. That's it. And they made no bones about it. If you read their writings at the time and their essays, their speeches, their books, they make no bones about it. You can't say it in any more straightforward manner than they did themselves. They said it's time to grasp hold of the educational system by the collar and change it in favor of collectivism so that we can change America. And they did.
And that's why, just in summation, just to get a straightforward confirmation, that's why we have all this left-wing, Marxist, socialist, globalist worldview happening in our colleges and universities today.
That's what made it possible. That's why. There are other factors. I mean, there are subversive elements. I'll get it out. There are subversive elements from other countries as well that are more interested in just conquest. They want our stuff. And I'm talking about, they want to invade us, and they want to take all of our stuff and eliminate people who get in the way. The Chinese are very, very open on that idea. They still talk about the United States being enemy number one, but they're perfectly happy to take our business and our money and our diplomats and our media experts around, show them a good time. But anyway, but nevertheless, yeah, the ideological foundation of all of this, this is interesting, even before the Soviet Union was formed, this idea of collectivism was being promoted by the super intellectuals of the world. And it's very fascinating. I didn't know that the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, was not the first communist revolution. It actually happened in Mexico And I thought, where have I been? And I didn't get any of this stuff in school. And it was a complete communist revolution in Mexico, complete with the firing squads, the execution, burning of churches, and the whole thing. That's where it started. And there were people around the world who were promoting collectivism, but they were all intellectuals, they were all highly educated, and most of them very wealthy individuals. That's where it started. And when they finally grabbed hold of the educational system, then it became institutionalized. And it's almost unstoppable until people realize how it started. And now there's been enough experience in the world to realize that through empirical evidence that collectivism is extremely destructive and always ends up in dictatorship.
Wow. All right. Now you mentioned it earlier, but I was hoping you could briefly talk about Mr. Dodd. He mentions meeting with Rowan Gaither of the Ford Foundation. Dodd talks about meeting with Rowan Gaither, and they talked about how in these foundations were former members of the OSS, the Office of Strategic.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that now. Thank you.
I thought that was so powerful. And I wondered, was this kind of the beginning of what today we call the deep state?
It sounds like it, doesn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I think it points up a very important fact of life today. And that is that the political structure that is on the surface is not the structure at all. There's something very much more deep than that. And it's always been that way. I think it's been that way throughout history, actually, that what you see on the surface is merely for eye candy. The real power movers and shakers are the ones that are behind the scenes, and they prefer to stay behind the scenes for obvious reasons, that every once in a while their projects fail and the masses come out with pitchforks, and the puppets are the ones that get the pitchforks, not the real movers and shakers. In fact, the movers or shakers are often leading the pitchfork people because they know it's come to that point and they want to be at the head of the parade. It's fascinating when you finally open your eyes and see the way the world really works.
The Carnegie Endowment seems to have had a lot to do with driving this whole thing from the beginning. Is that your impression as well?
Yes, the Carnegie Endowment was very active. Part of the minutes that they opened up to the secretary of Norman Dodd revealed that as World War I was coming to an end, one of the tasks that they undertook was, how do we prevent the war from ending? Now, you see the irony of this. This is a Carnegie Endowment Fund for Peace, conspiring in their minutes even, how do we prevent the war from ending so soon? And they explained it because under conditions of war, people are not asking questions about whether something is constitutional or whether it's right or wrong or whether it's going to work in the long run. All they want to know is, how do we win the war? As long as the war goes on and there's some type of great crisis or threat, people don't think about principles. They just think about winning or survival, which is, I think, an important lesson for the average person to understand and to learn, is that our world today is one crisis after another. It's either a war or a threat of war or something very close to the tragedy of war, so that people are in panic and fear. Under those conditions, they can change society much more rapidly. And it might only take a couple of generations instead of 10. So they understood this well at the Carnegie Fund, and they talked about it. So they said that if we want to bring about the kind of a world, in America at least, that we want, we have to be at war. So we don't want this war to end because we're making too much progress right now.
Well, I remember from Mr. Dodd's testimony, and you were asking him about it, and he said that they had done this study where they were asking, was there anything better than war to change a society? And they said, no, war is the best way to do it. And he says, then then they were asking the question, how to get America involved in a war. That was one of the questions they were asking.
Yes.
And I wondered, was Mr. Dodd suggesting that these foundations help to instigate World War I, or just America's involvement in it? What's your impression about that?
Well, I think we're talking about something that had its roots a little bit later on, like in the Council on Foreign Relations. Many of these same people, or the sons of these people and daughters, wound up in institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations, which were funded primarily by these tax-exempt foundations and by Cecil Rhodes over in England. It gets to be like a can of worms. But remember, this is a global movement we're talking about. It's not just the USA. Now, we're talking about the American tax-exempt foundations, of course, but they're kind of like appendages of a global movement toward collectivism. And a lot of that came out of the founding and funding of the Cecil Rhodes, one of the wealthiest men in the world, the creator of the Rhodes Scholarship and so forth. And that's another story, but it's similar because it shows how people of high intelligence and social caliber can get this dream of collectivism. And they say that we're going to put an end to wars if we just get rid of nationalities, we get all the world together under one government. And there can't be wars between governments if you only have one government. And it's kind of an alluring thought, but what they don't realize that you still can have a lot of suffering and death and tyranny and destruction all from that one government. Instead of two governments fighting each other, it's one government fighting its own people. But then nevertheless, a lot of that came from England and out of the Rhodes Foundation, and the Council on Foreign Relations is an outgrowth of that. And so that was the next phase of this whole movement. And it's hard to separate where one stopped and the second one began. It was just a generational evolution.
All right. I wanted to ask you, just to follow the timeline of the Reese Committee, how did the Reese Committee come to an end? I think the question a lot of people have is, this is remarkable information that's being uncovered in the 1950s. Whatever happened to it? How did it not get out to the American people?
Well, they published quite a bit of work, and you can still find those documents, but it was never popular. I mean, the media could have made a big splash out of it, but as I recall now, I think the funding was cut off. And so they just ran out of money and they had to dissolve the committee.
And one of the people, you mentioned her earlier, Catherine Casey.
Oh, Catherine Casey. Well, that was this secretary I was talking about. Yes.
And she's the one she was skeptical about all this. Then she goes to do the investigation and she uncovered all of this horrific information. Mm-hmm. And you talked about how she had a nervous breakdown. Is that what happened to her?
Well, Norman Dodd described it as follows. He said she almost lost her mind and she became unable to do her work. That's how he described it. So I guess you'd call that a nervous breakdown. Yeah, she wasn't there much longer after that. She had to, I guess, step aside because she couldn't take it. Now, we've tried to find her notes, and nobody's been able to find her notes so far. But she transcribed them from her own dictation. And it's one of the universities in the South that has supposedly acquired all of the papers of the Reese Foundation. I've tried very hard to see if they have uncovered anything like that. And they say that they have nothing like that in their archives. But anyway, yes, that was Catherine Casey. And Dodd says she almost lost her mind when she read this in the minutes.
Now I wanted to shift a little bit because even though I think it's still on the same topic, still has to do with globalism and collectivism, you produced another documentary called No Place to Hide. Remember that documentary that shows communism operating at it's really, I tell people, Mr. Griffin, that if you want to watch one documentary that is the greatest documentary ever produced on globalism, I tell them to watch No Place to Hide, because you're showing the pattern of what's happening, not just in America, but in Northern Ireland, over in Africa, all over the world. You're really way before anybody else, I think, had a grip on it the way you did. You're showing it as a truly global movement, and you're using the word terrorism, not pertaining it so much to Islam as much to these communists, that they're the ones who are engaging in these terrorist activities and blowing things up and all this other kind of stuff. That I found really remarkable. But probably the most powerful part to me was when you interviewed a man named Larry Grothwall. You remember Larry Grothwall?
I do remember Larry, yeah. He was with the weatherman, was he not?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He was an FBI informant who infiltrated the weather underground. And he talked about their plan to take over America for communism, and that they wanted to set up re-education camps across the country. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. It was kind of a bloodthirsty thought. He said, we sat around in living rooms and calmly discussed how we would kill several million people. Something to that effect.
Yeah, I think he had said it was about 25 million people that they were estimating that they were going to have to kill.
And they didn't seem to be concerned. It was all for the greater good of the greater number. So you're back to collectivism again.
Mm-hmm. But have you seen now here in the last few years, there have been more and more conversations, like at Harvard University, Alan Dershowitz, the lawyer, he made a video where he said that the students at Harvard University were passing around trying to get people to sign up with a petition to call for re-education camps to put Trump supporters and Republicans in.
Well, I remember seeing that. And I just thought to myself, oh, well, of course, naturally, that's how collectivists think. They'll call it a re-education center, but actually it's an extermination camp or a torture chamber or something like that. But all collectivist systems do that. And the fascists did it, the Nazis did it, the communists did it. And now, I'm sorry to say, Americans are becoming very open to doing it now. And because they think as a collectivist, and they think, well, these people are dangerous to the greater good of the greater number. So we have to get rid of them because we're the good guys. They actually think that way. The Nazis thought they were the good guys, getting rid of the Jews. They thought they were doing the right thing. It's mind-blowing, but that's what collectivism does to the mind.
Another point I was going to ask you about, Black Lives Matter. I'm sure you've seen all the footage on Black Lives Matter and everything that they did. At one point, their leaders came out and said that they were well-trained Marxists. I don't know if you saw that quote.
Oh, yes.
And then you do the research on it, come to find out the people who trained them were people from the Weather Underground.
Yes.
From the same movement.
And they were trained by experts from Moscow.
Really?
Yes. But so you can't say this is a Russian thing. It's international. I mean, some of the worst of those people are not from Russia at all. They're from the United States. And it starts with the mind. It's not a nationality thing. It's a character trait.
So what do you think then about the view? I mean, since you mentioned Russia, as opposed to the Soviet Union, my impression has been that the Russian people are not really fond of the Soviet era. They're glad to be rid of it. And that their country was hijacked by these Bolsheviks who took control of their system, basically. That's been my impression. What do you think? How does all of that play into what's going on today with Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine and what's happening over there? People seem to be talking about Russia as though Russia is still the Soviet enemy. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And some people are not. Others are falling. I use the word purposely. They're falling for the line that Putin is a good guy because Putin is exposing some of the absurd and dangerous policies of the United States. Therefore, he must be good. You know, an enemy of my enemy has got to be my friend is not a good conclusion at all. Putin comes from the KGB, but he's smart enough to know what to say, and in order to create the illusion that, gee, maybe we should support Russia. Now you made a good point. There's a difference between Russia and the Russian people, just as there's a difference between America and the American people. I'm sorry to say. It used to be that America and the American people were pretty synonymous, but not anymore. So we have to distinguish, not label people by their national origin or their race or their religion or something like that. But so it gets very confusing. That's why I think we have to go back to the fundamental and look at the real essence of the conflict. It's collectivism versus individualism, regardless of the nationality. Now, what's going on in the Ukraine, I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but it looks to me that Ukraine has become a puppet of the deep state in America. And it looks to me also like these maniacs are anxious for a real war. And why would they want a war? The Carnegie Fund told us in times of war, you can change society very quickly. If we had an atomic attack on Cincinnati, for example, all opposition to everything would be ended. We wouldn't worry about a constitution. We wouldn't worry about anything. As we're in an atomic war. And so they'd lose a few million people. Greater good of the greater number. The rest of society, the rest of the world would go along with everything the people in government told them to do. In times of war, not only is it very easy to change society, but it's also very profitable for the military-industrial complex. It's as simple as that.
Do you know whatever happened to Norman Dodd? I found him since I saw your interview with him, which I just thought was, you interviewed him, and also an old friend of mine, I think somebody that you may have known years ago, the late Dr. Stan Monteith. Oh, yes. Dr. Stan interviewed Norman Dodd as well. But I always wondered whatever happened to Mr. Dodd. He, on the one hand, he was very knowledgeable. He seemed very, very patriotic, but he also seemed a little bit, in the interview with Dr. Stan Monteith, his demeanor was that it was almost like America's over. You know, we're headed down this path, and he wasn't sure if we could get back from it.
My recollection is that Norman Dodd had that fatalistic view when I interviewed him. He really didn't have much hope because he saw that collectivism was on the march and nobody even knew what he was talking about and didn't seem to care. And he was almost like a broken man when we got onto that topic. He was strong in his recollection when he talked about his involvement and what he did and what he believed in. But when we got into the topic of what the future holds, he's like many of our friends today. They think it's over. I mean, they've already captured the school. They've captured the court system. They've captured the political system. They're in all the intelligence agencies. They run the banking system. You know, what can you do? And I have to acknowledge that what they say is true. But I'm not willing to take such a pessimistic view because I've seen this before in history. At the last minute, something happens. The human spirit, the desire for freedom, and the awakening of the truth. It's a powerful force. I think the most dramatic illustration would be Washington crossing the Delaware and the surprise attack on Trenton and turning the whole Revolutionary War around. I mean, that ragtag army in many cases didn't even have shoes. They were walking with rags around their feet. They had rifles, but no ammunition. It was cold, freezing, and the enemy had beaten them every time. And here it was 2 days before half of them were going to go home because their enlistment was over and they were going to go back to their families. And Washington gets on his horse, I suppose, or walked in front of his men and said, I want you can go home if you wish, but now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. Who is with me? And all of them were. So they crossed the Delaware, freezing cold. Can you imagine? Crossing in the middle of the night, Christmas Eve, and freezing to death, some of them falling into the water. One cannon on a little barge are trying to get over to the shore, and they get up there and to intercept them, nobody there. They get to the little town of Trenton, and they see a British cannon facing their way, nobody there to guard the cannon. All the soldiers are, the British and the Hessian soldiers are in bed. They're sleeping off their hangover. The British cannon around fire, boom, down the street, and all the soldiers run away. And so anyway, and that turned the war. It turned the war around. And I think there's a lot of parallel there today. It takes courage, it takes dedication, it takes an ideal, freedom, to drive men to do things that the enemies whose ideal is slavery cannot. They'll run and hide when they think they're going to lose. Men fighting their freedom will fight right to the end, but men fighting to conquer will not fight to the end. So I think of all those things when the issue comes up of what are we going to do? I mean, we're hopelessly outnumbered. We've lost. No, we have not lost. We have much to do, and we can still win. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be a hell of a fight. There's going to be a lot of pain and suffering and losses. But freedom, I think, will always win. We may not be here to see it, but we can play part of it.
Amen. What do you think, sir? I've wanted to ask you this, and I've waited toward the end to ask you. What do you think about the Christian foundation of our country? How important do you think that is in terms of recovering the faith of our ancestors, and at least what I have seen as really a biblical foundation going back to the early colonies?
Well, I think it's very important, not from a theological point of view so much, because that's not my field. I mean, I'm not a theologian, but I think it's important because Christianity is based on the principle of individualism. I mean, individuals they have salvation one at a time. You know, we come in and one at a time, we go out one at a time. It's not all Americans are saved, have salvation, or all Germans or something like that. So I think that whole idea of individual salvation is very essential if you're thinking in terms of individualism as a political or cultural force. And of course, when our founding fathers were putting all this together, a lot of people who came to America were escaping tyranny. So the idea of freedom was very uppermost in their minds. Not quite the same today because we were born into it, but a lot of people had to escape tyranny. And so all those ideas were fresh at the time of the revolution. So I think it's an important concept. And I also think it's important to have an ideal that is bigger than oneself, that one is willing to believe in and feel like you're willing to sacrifice for. So any system that's evolving around the state as the source of unity and faith and salvation, and that means all collectivist systems, the Nazis, the fascists, the communists, and socialists, and so forth, they have to be enemies of two things. They have to be enemies of religion, and they have to be enemies of the family, because both of those will draw people's loyalty away and dependence away from the state. So I think it's a very good question, and I think the answer is definitely yes. It had a profound effect on it.
Well, we have actually gone for right at about an hour, sir. Can you believe that?
No, I can't believe it.
But this has been really fantastic. I wanted to, in closing, I wanted to ask you, and you've already said so many powerful and I think wonderful things so far, but in closing, what would you say to Americans? What would you say to the American people now who care about what's happening and who want to do something? What would your wisdom? I mean, you've studied this. You've studied globalism in our country, I think probably longer than any other person living that I know of. And you've been able to foresee the things that would happen. There's old black and white footage of you from decades ago documenting all of this. You've foreseen so much of it. What wisdom do you have for Americans today who are just learning about this and who care about our country and want to preserve our freedom? What would you say to them?
I would say be thankful that we're born in this age, because we're given the rare opportunity to make a great difference in the world and to change the future. Be thankful for that opportunity and don't waste it.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. All right, Mr. Griffin, I think that concludes all of the questions that I have, sir. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, we got the gist of the story out, and with your help, by the way, thank you.
Well, you with your help. I mean, I'm studying your work. I mean, it's just, and there's so many more questions that I could ask, and so many other things that you've covered. I mean, we haven't even gotten into the Federal Reserve or all of that. But a lot of people ask you about that stuff, and so I kind of wanted to move into other areas here.
Yeah, I'm glad you did.
Well, that concludes my interview with Mr. G. Edward Griffin. I really, really enjoyed meeting Mr. Griffin. However, we met really online. I had actually been to a conference years ago. I still can't remember exactly which one, but where he was there, he was one of the speakers. I was one of the speakers, and he and I did not have an actual chance to meet each other because at that conference there were, from what I remember, about 8 or 10 different speakers at the time, and he was one of them. I passed him in the hallway. We sort of smiled and nodded at each other because we were both there giving presentations. But this was the first time I actually had a chance to talk with him, even though it was a Zoom call. Still, it was great to be able to meet him, to talk to him. Very, very nice man. Very generous with his time and with all the knowledge and the information that he's gathered over so many years. Information that is now proving to be of critically great importance to our generation right now, because all of the things that he was warning about in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and so on are now coming to a great conclusion here as these globalists are bringing all of the parts of their plan together to thoroughly enslave America and effectively destroy whatever freedom there is in this country and throughout the world. That's the way it appears to many of us. And certainly that is the direction that the entire New World Order agenda is headed. So, what can we do as God-fearing, Bible-believing Christian people? We lift our eyes to heaven. We cry out to God for his help, for his guidance, and we remember the Lord's promises during this time. We remember how the Lord has told us, only fear the Lord, do not fear other gods. We're not supposed to be in fear of Karl Marx or of Allah or of, the globalists or of any of these overlords of tyranny and oppression and evil. The Bible says only fear the Lord and he will deliver us from the hands of all our enemies. Praise the Lord. All right, brethren, that's going to do it for us today. That is our show. We'll stop it there, but we will be back next time as the Lord leads us. Until then, God bless you guys. I'm Chris Pinto, and you've been listening to Noise of Thunder Radio.